discussion on the pros and cons of the public cloud. We've got a brilliant lineup of people from sort of different areas of interacting with the cloud, so hopefully you can pose any question you want to them and they should be able to take it on and tackle it. So we will be throwing it open to questions at the end, so do get thinking what you might ask them. But first of all, let's just go down our panel and I'll let you guys introduce yourself and tell us your involvement with the cloud. Andy, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, so my name is Andrew Gilbert. I'm the CEO and founder of Node4. So
this event is your creation.
It's Paul's and the team's creation, but yeah, it's partly to do with me. 15 years ago, I founded this business, so hopefully you'll get a better understanding of what we're all about by the end of today. So yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. I just take the opportunity to say that, but yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Simon.
So Simon Hazlitt. I was a soldier for 10 years. And then moved into the city. I was Merrill Lynch's IT strategist during the dot-com boom, those of you who remember those days, and then co-founded Majetti Asset Management, exclusively in the cloud in 2002 with no IT department then, and one of our suppliers was Node4.
2002, that's very early on in cloud computing history.
And so I retired from Majetti and now operate helping businesses with their sort of cloudy problems, if you like. And wrote a book called Running on Air in 2005, just trying to help businesses work out how to use the cloud.
Wow, that's quite a long time ago as well. You've been around for a while.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Breathtaking. Monty, how about you?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Monty. I'm a Director of Product Marketing at Microsoft for our Azure business, and I sit on the Azure leadership team in the UK.
Brilliant. And finally, Ian.
Hello, I'm Ian Hardiman. I'm the Network Manager from the Freight Transport Association. We're one of the largest trade associations in the UK, and I've been managing their infrastructure for 19 years now.
So you're bringing the customer perspective to this panel?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, as this is a panel about the pros and cons of the public cloud, let me throw it out there and just sort of ask what your definition of the public cloud is. Andy?
Interesting question, I think. I think it depends on who you ask and the context in which they're asking it. But I think from Node4's perspective, the way we see public cloud is we probably talk a lot about the hyperscalers. So obviously Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. So for us, it's that would be public cloud, but for some people, they may see that as Office 365, Gmail, and the fact that their iPhone syncs something to the cloud. But yeah.
Panel, would you agree with that?
Agree with that.
Okay, so we're going for the big definition of it. And what is really driving the demand for the public cloud at the moment, Simon?
I think there's a number of things. Interestingly, I think often it's a business demand. So you get a lot of kind of rogue marketing departments going to Salesforce.com. So it's a SaaS demand, I think, where businesses see that they can deploy things really quickly. I think the other point is, frankly, cost. It is radically cheaper to go that way. So I think those are the two main ones that I can see.
And Monty, is that the sort of the common people, the reason why the people go to Azure? Is it a cost factor predominantly?
So I think cost is a factor, but cost needs to be managed because a lot of people take their as-is infrastructure and move it to cloud and expect it straight away to be cheaper. That's not necessarily going to be the case. Cloud can be significantly more cost effective, but I think increasingly we're seeing companies think about the innovation opportunity. So cloud really enables organizations to be far more innovative and agile in the way that they're able to do things, whether that's deploying and managing applications, whether that's leveraging data and the way that they can understand data and become more data-driven. So I think innovation and the opportunity that cloud affords towards becoming more agile and innovative is another big theme and a big motivator I would call out.
Brilliant. Well, we'll unpack sort of innovation in a little moment. Ian, talk us about FTA's journey to cloud migration. Has that happened recently, or has that been around for a while?
It started off with a number of servers, then that grew into a number more servers. Then we went to VMware, and then servers really exploded. And from there, to meet the demands of scalability, rather than having to have a big capital budget and make a large hardware purchase to bring up the capability for your infrastructure, if you put it in the cloud, it's all there ready for you to pull off as you require.
So would you say that's been the main advantage for you guys?
Yeah, I think so. It's the scalability and the flexibility.
Any other advantages that you've experienced?
Not cost yet. But
Not cost yet. Still holding out for that one. Andy, let's talk about more broadly the advantages of being in the cloud. You know, what would you say are the main pointers that you would discuss with businesses if they were coming to you?
I mean, I think again it comes back to context, right? So I think agility, I think, is a key one. I think what you're starting to see now is a developer-led kind of environment. They're born in the cloud, software as a service. I think small startups building SaaS applications, giving them access to technology cost effectively to try out new ideas, develop technology that maybe they wouldn't have had access to before. So if we think about some of the guys that are here today talking about AI, we've got small organizations that are developing AI-based applications, harnessing different cloud infrastructure to do that, trying to develop that initial infrastructure just to get an idea off the ground from the start would be really challenging traditionally.
Yeah.
If we go back 10, 20 years, 2002,
Yeah.
that would have been revolutionary. So being able to have access to that scalable compute resource to try and work out some of these models, I think would have been challenging to do in a traditional capacity and just not viable from a cost perspective. So I think that's one end, and then obviously from the other side we see big enterprise going through digital transformation and using public cloud as a way of managing that transition of legacy infrastructure. As maybe it might be temporary resource or temporary infrastructure while doing a transition from one application to another. So it can be very complex and it can be, I think, quite dynamic.
So you would say cloud complexity is increasing?
Absolutely, for sure. And I think that's one of the challenges that probably all of these guys are facing, like from a customer perspective or from a Microsoft Azure perspective. It isn't as simple as click, click, click,
Run
send
the cloud.
to the cloud. Yeah, it's like running the wizard on your iPhone. I think what we're starting to see is a lot of complexity in organizations, and the manageability of it, the cost control, the security element of it is quite challenging. And when you look at it, from the outset, it looks quite easy, but actually, once it's there and it's operating, managing it's quite difficult.
Brilliant. And Simon, you help companies try and navigate some of that complexity.
Yeah, I think, well, yes, absolutely. And the cloud actually isn't a technological revolution, because I remember the bureau services from the main custodial banks 30 years ago, which were effectively AS400 terminals that you had in your own offices. So one's got to be careful about sort of thinking that this was new stuff. What the cloud is a governance revolution, or potentially. So it offers the prospect of businesses to manage their own information and end the outsourcing relationship they never knew they ever had, which was their information to IT people.
Yep.
And I don't mean to diss IT people. This would be extremely tactless in a room like this. But the fact remains that a business is best placed to manage its own information. So the cloud takes the technology away, and you can concentrate on that. But I would absolutely agree that it's not a silver bullet, and that there are a great many concerns and worries about it. Most actually, in the way that we see it in our own lives, where we have 48 million different passwords and credentials, and you're forced in that siloed way to go from one cloud application to another. The danger is a business, you have the same problem, and that actually the governance model is designed to draw the threads in from the different cloud services and bring it all together in virtual aggregation for an employee that actually makes sense for them. And that isn't trivial, but it's not the same skills as a database administrator. It's a far less digital set of skills and far more emotional IQ, interestingly. And I think that's one of the major challenges, is actually getting the best out of the cloud. It requires people who haven't historically been associated with technology.
Yeah. Monty, you mentioned earlier how the cloud can drive innovation as sort of one of the advantages around it. Can you pick that a little bit more for us?
Sure. I mean, so if we think about disruptors, the major disruptors in the market over the last sort of X number of years, 5, 6, 8, 10 years, people like Uber, people like Airbnb, the well-known examples where people have sort of disrupted existing markets digitally. Essentially, they've built on the shoulders of giants in the sense of the hyperscalers to leverage the ability to build and deploy and iterate on applications very, very quickly.
Yeah.
We very much live, Microsoft, we have a big mantra led by our CEO, Satya Nadella, about growth mindset. And that's all about failing fast and learning from that failure and constantly learning, not being a know-it-all, being a learn-it-all. And actually cloud is a great enabler for that because actually it enables organizations to try new things, try them quickly, understand what does work and what doesn't work, major and pivot on the bits which do work and continue to invest there and de-invest in things that don't work. Historically, that was a big challenge. You had long lead times in terms of procuring infrastructure, in terms of getting it into the data center. In regulated industries like finance, that could take 6 months. Literally 6 months to get physical infrastructure into the data center, by which point the business requirements have moved on. That's no longer what they need anymore, So cloud is an enabler for organizations to be able to do things much, much quicker, try them, spin up infrastructure as needed very, very quickly. If it doesn't work, scale it down again. You haven't had the big capital expenditure. You pay for what you use. And increasingly, I'm going to pick up very quickly, the cloud is getting more complex.
Yes.
We are all trying as hyperscale vendors to make it as simple as possible, although the requirements out there in the market are incredibly complex. And so there's many, many ways to achieve the outcome. But thinking about the big focus in the market now around containers, around orchestration of containers with Kubernetes, these are areas of technology which are only going to further enhance the ability for organizations to manage their costs and to iterate and become more agile and change at scale and at pace. So it may appear to be getting more complex. We're doing everything we can to not make it complex, but fundamentally it comes back to helping our customers in the market have the skills that they need to understand the opportunity. And that's probably a bigger topic that we'll come back to.
No, not at all. Ian, have you experienced some of that complexity firsthand?
You move into Azure and all of a sudden you've got this portal which changes very, very regularly. And so where you were 3 months ago, you go back into it and it's completely different.
Yeah.
So it's very much a moving playing field.
Yeah. And is the company on board with being able to navigate around that change?
It's a learning zone. We're still very much with our legacy, and we've got our toe in the water as Azure, and the idea is to build things as workloads in the future.
Right.
Rather than to get away from the old way of doing things. And definitely going to be using Azure to do that.
Brilliant. So we've got innovation, agility. What about sort of the pricing of it? Is that seen as an advantage or sometimes as a disadvantage, Andy?
Yeah, I think again it comes back to how you manage that and what it is that you do in Azure. Going back to what I said at the start, there is certain scale and services that you can use that are cost effective by using a hyperscaler versus building it yourself, especially if you've got peaky and trophy workloads or whatever it might be. But the other challenge is, traditionally what we've seen in certain scenarios where people have gone into Azure previously, it's been developer-led. Developers don't care about no offense if there's any developers in the room, but about the cost control element. That they just want to develop their application, build a successful application and get it released. And I think, that whole cost control piece, if someone's just lifting and shifting a load of VMs from some physical infrastructure and putting it into Azure and not doing any form of transformation, that's not cost effective either. So I think it just comes down to a governance, and in certain scenarios, depending on what you're doing and the application that you're deploying and how your business then operates, will come down to whether it's right for you in the first place and whether financially it works for you as well, because it can very easily get out of control if it's not managed.
Yeah. Simon, have you seen that firsthand?
Yeah, I take you back to 2002 and we went for something called application service provision, which is what the cloud subsequently became known as.
Right.
And the reason why we did it was simply, I'm a historian soldier, I'm not a technologist, was that it was OPEX. So it's operating expenditure rather than CapEx. So when you think about a startup, you've got this hockey stick where you go into cash flow negativity, and then with any luck, as you earn money at the top line, you break even. But the problem with institutional fund management, with billions of pounds, you need to demonstrate a big system before anyone is going to give you any money. So you have this chicken and the egg issue, and rather than capitalize 40 million quid with KPMG or someone buying in a system, the whole idea was to rent it. And by renting it, you could get the top line going before the bottom line, so, and then the bottom line then suddenly became positive. So you got massively a quicker route to profitability. So the costs in total might be the same, but the nature of those lowered the financial risks.
Yes.
Because you rent it. So you didn't have those capitalized startup costs where you borrowed money from the bank or whatever. So I think that's a really, really important point for startups, that it's OPEX, not CAPEX.
Brilliant. Monty.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on a comment I made a little earlier about people often take their as-is and move it to the cloud, and then shortly after having done that, they think, well, actually, hold on, this is costing a lot of money. There's a lot of requirement, I would say, to think about cloud adoption based around a framework, and we have a proven framework around that at Microsoft to help customers, because you need to look at the governance, you need to look at optimizing what you have, rather than just taking the legacy and saying, well, we're going to move it from there and we're going to move it to here and expect everything to be hunky-dory. I think there's a huge opportunity for organizations to look at optimizing what they have, right-sizing, using a lot of the capability that sits on clouds to reduce cost. There was a gentleman on the stage earlier from NetApp. We made announcements around that we've got NetApp Files coming as a managed service. We've got VMware as a managed service. We've got various other third-party managed services from Microsoft. Those managed services are managed, and I keep stressing that word because that means that actually we take away cost and complexity from the market to think about how you manage those services. Essentially, hypercloud scale vendors are working together to take away cost and complexity from you to manage a lot of those services. So there's a great opportunity to think about how you can operationalize take advantage of operational effectiveness and efficiency essentially with cloud, which I don't see enough customers perhaps giving the focus that they ought to really take advantage of cloud. That then means you're freeing up time for people to spend on other activity. To go back to the startup mentality, they want to focus on differentiating and building their products. They don't want to focus on managing backups, database patching, etc., etc. So going to the cloud, if done correctly, rather than just taking virtual machines from here and dropping them there, can actually offer a lot of cost saving if done correctly.
Yeah. When people come to you, what are people's most common concerns about sort of migrating onto the cloud?
I think so. Security remains key. I think. Fundamentally, the interesting thing is that often we speak to customers who sort of are concerned about security, understandably, security of their data and so on. I think one of the best things that we do with customers is take them to our data center in Dublin, for example. And when they actually visit that place, they realize that our data centers are more secure than any of their data centers could ever possibly be. Microsoft, behind the Department of Defense in the US, is the second most attacked organization on the planet for cybercrime. We have teams of people. Anyone remembers the Milky Way advert? We've got the red team and the blue team internally. They're not having a race. Well, they are having a race because the red team is trying to hack into our own systems. The blue team is constantly fending them off. We have billions of dollars in investment in cybersecurity, and fundamentally I would say that there's a great amount of collateral and example we can bring to customers to allay their concerns around security. However, they still need to architect their solutions effectively, and actually at the end of the day they're only as secure as someone's password, because fundamentally if we're securing everything on the cloud but if they're not securing their endpoints and the way into their network, then actually they need to, they can't just say, okay, you've got all the certs, Microsoft, fantastic, we're good. So security remains a key factor, but there's a very, very good conversation to be had around that. I think also skills, and I touched on this briefly earlier. I think skills is a key area that we and all the other hyperscale vendors right now are investing in right now, because it's really important that people understand. There's lots of stuff which I'm mentioning here, but actually if you've got legacy IT departments or legacy technologists, they may not know about this opportunity. Yeah. And so we're investing significantly in certifications and free events. We've got a learning platform called Microsoft Learn. So if you were to Bing or maybe Google that, you might find it, which is a free learning environment where you've got learning paths by role and by type and so on that you can follow to get you skilled and equipped to understand how to take advantage of a lot of this amazing technology. But I think, there's probably more, but I'm mindful of time. Those two I'll highlight for now.
Ian, I can see you nodding away there when Monty was speaking about the security issues. Is that something that you've experienced as well?
Haven't really experienced it, but very much aware of developers haven't necessarily got security in mind when they're putting things together. They've got input and they've got output, and if they get that bit right, they think their job's done. So it's a matter of keeping an eye on them.
So Node4 have carried out some research focusing in on mid-market companies, and they found that very few are shedding all other infrastructure options for a cloud-only approach. In fact, just 1% had 100% of their workloads in the cloud. I'll start with you, Andy. Like, why do you think mid-market businesses are not putting everything into the cloud, and should they be?
I mean, again, you've got a lot of organisations. These organisations that have grown up over many years have got a lot of legacy complex IT. And as I said before, it's not just one click to move to the cloud. And what does the cloud mean? I mean, we've got organizations that come to us today, and by moving their servers into our data center, they believe that is the cloud.
Yes,
right?
they're
done. We've ticked that box because we've now put our stuff in someone else's data center. And technically, at the really base level, that kind of could be a definition. But ultimately, you've got different people in different stages of their journey, and different organizations looking at different things, and their cloud strategies can be very different. Someone's cloud strategy could be, we're going to move to Office 365, and we're going to move all of our accounting platform to zero. And there you go, done. Like, what else do I need? I need to give my staff some iPads, and away we go. So I just think it's such a diverse, complex environment with different organizations in different areas of their digital transformation journey, that it is a really complex environment. So I suppose this is where we come in, and where we've seen our advantages. Organisation that owns data centers, we own our own sort of IaaS, call it cloud platforms, and obviously we're working with Microsoft and others where we can kind of stitch all of this stuff together and try and help people on their journey. And today that might literally be moving their servers into the data center and providing some interconnectivity to Azure.
Yep.
And then over time, they will slowly move their applications, redevelop their applications, or acquire new applications that are completely born in the cloud. And somehow we have to make all of that work together.
Yes.
We have to provide the governance and the security and the policy and the management, because again, I get the data center is physically secure, but typically a customer's only one click away from being unsecure, because all it can take is somebody to do something, a mistake with a policy, and all of a sudden that people have got access to data. And we've seen that before, where people have used S3 in AWS and put a load of sensitive information in what a developer thought was a bucket of data, and all of a sudden that's publicly available to the internet, and everyone's got access to these sensitive documents. So I think governance and working with a provider that really understands that landscape and how to bring control to it is really important.
Brilliant. And not all of the cloud is as secure as things like Azure. What can be done to ensure an appropriate level of security in an increasing fragmented landscape? Simon, is there some points that you'd like to touch
it's a really good point, because most of the stuff, I would think of it in terms of public hygiene.
Yeah.
If you go around not washing your hands after going to the loo, and frankly not washing your clothes or whatever, you're going to have to need some pretty complex antibiotics to avoid some serious infections.
Yeah.
But the opposite is also true. If you have good basic habits, and in this case it's patching devices, it's making sure that information, you're clear what information is where, then actually the security bill becomes much lower.
Yeah.
So actually, in most cases, it is a function, again, not of necessarily technological skills. It's just someone who's good at organizing and has got a grip and getting the ducks in a line from an information perspective. Because often people will say to me, oh, well, we've got ISO X, Y, and Z, and we're flipping brilliant. And then you see one of their relationship managers disappearing out of the door with a whole pile of paper of client information. and you say and that's ironically because everything is so locked down from a technological perspective that they have to break the rules to do their job. So I think you've got to be careful about thinking of this as a technological challenge, particularly as these guys and other, the big cloud providers will lock that down. You just need to know where your critical information is, and make sure you defend the critical stuff. Like as a soldier, the critical stuff you defend with your life. The battalion canteen, well, frankly, that can fend for itself. And it's the same with information.
Yeah.
And you need to differentiate between the things that are valuable and the things that should just remain confidential.
Yeah, yeah. Ian, are there any other drawbacks of the cloud, as we're speaking about the pros and cons that you've come across that's outside of the things we've already spoken about?
As people have said, you can't, the picking up of your infrastructure and dropping it into the cloud isn't really the solution, because the architecture doesn't, the pricing doesn't scale in the right way. It's a different philosophy to approach it. So from that point of view, everything needs to be thought about and migrated, or if you like, tailored towards putting it in the cloud, rather than just moving it there.
Brilliant, brilliant. Let's just see if any of the audience want to jump in and ask any specific questions at this point. Would anyone like to ask our panel anything? All gone quiet on me.
Shy bunch.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll come back to you guys in a bit. Have a little think if there's anything you want to ask our cloud panel. So let's talk about what is a typical backup recovery policy when it comes to the cloud, Andy.
Like physical infrastructure, again, complexity, or a backup. I mean, some people now, obviously, IT systems are becoming critical to organisations. So a lot of what we're seeing is people's RPO, so the time to recover, it is reducing their expectation of this always-on infrastructure. Typically these organisations are heavily reliant on IT.
Yeah.
So people just think, again, put it in the cloud. It's completely replicated all over the world, and if something happens somewhere, then it's still going to be available. Which is obviously never quite the case. So I think backup strategy has probably moved away from that legacy. Well, we'll put it on a tape, put it in a vault, and at some point we might need it. To actually thinking about always on availability. So active replication to another data center, and that whole sort of mean time to recovery. So I think that changes the landscape a little bit. But again, that comes back to the design of the application and thought going into how are you going to migrate these workloads and these applications, and what does that look like, because some of these applications have to be built in a certain way to make that possible. So again, all of this stuff is something that you need to consider when going into the cloud, and it keeps using the word complexity, but they're the kind, when we talk about complexity, they're some of the things that we think about from a consideration perspective.
So what does a successful cloud and application strategy look like in 2019? Is there a
Move it
simple
all to
answer?
Node4. Just come and pick up the phone.
I can't give away your trade secrets.
I can't give the secret sauce away, can I? I mean, therefore, so I think I need to continue to build a successful business. So
this panel discussion will ruin you.
That's right, yeah. And it's certainly not pick up the phone to Microsoft or go to Azure.
Only through Node4.
Yeah, you've got to go to www.node4.co.uk. I haven't plugged anything yet, actually.
Me neither. It's time yet.
Yeah, go, Monty. What do you think for you? What does a successful cloud and application strategy look like?
So I think it's. Well, if I may, I'm going to quickly pick up
Yeah,
one other
please
piece
do.
on the backup
Of course,
piece,
of
because I've got what I think is an interesting but frightening example.
Yeah.
Picks up on what Andy said actually around, and I mentioned resilient architecture
Yes.
earlier. That's a big part of our cloud adoption framework and a big part of the value that our partners such as Node4 add. But a scary story I heard a couple of years ago, there was a hospital in the US. It was one of our customers that should remain nameless, but essentially they were moving their 911, the equivalent of the emergency, the 999 ambulance deployment solution to the cloud, and they decided they wanted to do it themselves with a not very experienced partner, and someone thankfully decided it would be a good idea just to get Microsoft in to do a quiet validation before they went live, and their architecture was a single virtual machine to run that environment. And you kind of think to yourself, that perfectly articulates the importance of resilient architecture when thinking about the basics, right? So cloud is not the silver bullet if you're doing infrastructure as a service to provide that resilience. You've got to architect the appropriate infrastructure, architecture. You've got to get it right and resilient. You can then be scaled up to be globally resilient if needed, dependent on the use case. But one thing I'll very quickly mention, and this is a little bit of a plug, increasingly, and it goes back to the application approach, increasingly we're seeing people saying, well, I've got a legacy application that runs on virtual machines today. We need to keep running it, but actually we don't want to worry about running virtual machines and so on. Well, actually, why don't you migrate it across to something like Azure App Service, which is a managed platform as a service offering to run websites, web applications. Because it's managed, we do all the patching for you. If you want to scale it out globally, you go to the portal and say, slide the slider, I want it to be in Asia, I want it to be in the US, done. That's the sort of thing when thinking about modern applications that hyperscale cloud gives you. So don't think about taking, you've got to think beyond the existing virtual machines and how you actually move away from virtual machines where appropriate and where possible to actually modernize around platform as a service components, because that's what gives you more resilience, more flexibility, more agility, and that's kind of aligned to the question you asked.
Yeah, absolutely. And Simon, I'll also ask you the same question. What does a successful cloud and application strategy look like in 2019? Would you say?
Yeah, I think. I mean, the point is, I think it'll be a matter of time before people move.
Okay, so it's inevitable.
And I say that because I think back to, I wasn't quite alive, but almost, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and electricity, because most businesses had electricity generation departments. They had some really professional people who were very proud of the bespoke nature of the electricity that was being supplied. And then the penny sort of dropped that actually people worked out that it wasn't the bespoke nature of the electricity that made the difference. It was what they did with it.
Yes.
And actually, surely, we'll just stick a 3-pin plug if you're in the UK, and we'll get that electricity, and that's good enough, and it's much more scalable. And of course, it took time because you had embedded infrastructure that people were depreciating, and so they were running through. But actually, it was utterly bonkers in our to think that we would actually have a separate generation team now.
Yes.
So I think the successful strategy is to move, but I also think that it needs, like moving house, rather than taking what's in the loft and putting it in the new loft, is actually to go through a lock, stock and barrel process of saying, flipping hell, those pictures of Auntie Edna, I don't think we need to chuck that out, and we need to actually think about how we as a business would run our IT.
Yes.
And to me, that is so much quicker to market, because these days productivity is not the Henry Ford Stakhanovite A to B, how many widgets can we produce? That's not, productivity is flexibility.
Yeah.
It's the ability to tap end demand as it morphs in different ways. And the only way to do that is to have a very flexible information structure. And as far as I can see, being very controversial, and is actually ultimately that means sitting on the cloud on public applications.
Okay. Brilliant. Ian, are application development strategies now more important than cloud migration? Would you say, having gone through the process?
Cloud migration, the term implies that you're taking what you've already got and moving it into there, whereas the application development strategy is, I suppose, a different way of doing the same thing. In other words, converting it into workloads and moving those workloads in rather than moving the existing lump you've got. So yes, I would say very much so. Yeah.
And Andy, do you want to pick up on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk a lot to customers. I mean, really all they care about is an SLA these days. They don't want to look after infrastructure. Yeah. And whether they're either buying an application as a software as a service, or their organisation is bespoke, or that's their edge. They need to develop their application and be custom. So we are starting to see a developer application-led focus, and I think again that is where born in the cloud, using hyperscalers, that's where the trend is, because of all the things that we've all talked about, that scalability and that ability to switch things on and off and test and run dev environments, and that's where the agility and the cost effectiveness really kicks in. And again, I agree that ultimately over time everyone's going to go that way, but there is
it has to be a journey.
It's a long journey. It's a rocky road, and for different organisations at different points in their journey, we've still got customers that are running on AS400 systems, in our data centre, that you look at them with the green screen monitor sat on top of the server in a cage, and you think this thing's like 30 years old, and how's it still running?
So the biggest risk there as well, it goes back to skills though, because the people who actually know to run those systems are actually retiring.
Absolutely.
Wow.
You know, and
Yeah.
actually businesses are still entirely dependent on AS400, but actually they haven't got people to look after them anymore. So
that's
it's,
right.
you know, wind the clock forward a few more years. There's already partners out there, there's already organisations out there looking to emulate AS400 on public cloud, because inevitably they're going to persist. But the people who are running them don't actually they want to retire and enjoy their lives. You know, so.
And skill set, I think skill set is a big thing as well. Skill set is a challenge.
Yes.
Especially again with some of this legacy technology, and we talk about Oracle, you know, again, and the complexity of that, and finding good DBAs that, you know, really have the knowledge and experience. It's, you know, the cost of these guys are increasing, and you know, trying to get good people is a challenge as well. And we face that as a service provider, but obviously organisations are feeling that as well at scale. So
Yeah. Monty, was there another point you wanted to add? I felt like you were about to jump in, but no, maybe I was making that up.
I could talk forever, but I won't.
Oh well, please do. Let's throw any other questions from the audience that anyone would like to throw. So there's a mic coming to you. A broken mic coming to you.
Sorry. So I had a question somewhat related to what we were just talking about in terms of skills.
Yeah.
And you're talking specifically about kind of legacy skills, IBM and things like that. But what do you think about actually the skills needed to move yourself into public cloud, and how able kind of people that are used to working in traditional dedicated infrastructure can translate their skills into that public cloud environment?
Brilliant. Who would like to take that? Monty?
So just so everyone's clear, the question was how, I guess summarising, how transferable are the legacy skills for moving to cloud, and what's needed. So I think I mentioned it a couple of times already, but skills is inherently a success factor, I would say, for customers moving to cloud. They need to think about skills, and Microsoft and others are investing significantly in sort of helping organisations skill up their people. Our partners add a lot of value as well in terms of doing skills transfer and so on. There are a number of learning platforms. So I mentioned Microsoft Learn earlier, which people can follow learning paths. We're also going to be running a whole bunch of first-party events within the UK over the next year and beyond. So at least 2 or 3 a week around the country, which is aligned to our curriculum. So to help people skill up and understand cloud basics in the first point, but then taking that further to help developers modernize their skill set as well. So how transferable are they? I think very. I think it's a different mindset, but actually it's very fundamentally an existing technologist with the correct support should definitely be able to transfer those skills across to take advantage of cloud pretty quickly.
Ian, have you experienced that? Have people, could they transfer their skills quite easily?
It's a journey I'm on myself. So we're not that far into moving our applications into there, so I think I'm going to be taking up his Microsoft Learn.
You'll be asking some help. Please, sir, come over here. Any extra lessons would be most appreciated.
Ask me next year.
Okay, they're in the process, in the learning curve still. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, gentlemen here. We'll get a mic to you. Thank you.
What's the one biggest error that customers make when they move to the public cloud?
Andy, have you got one
biggest
error that people do when they move?
There's one error that we could pinpoint that customers make when they move to a public cloud, because the rhetoric is that it's all going to be amazing, you click a button and it's all going to work, but what's the one biggest issue that customers face, an error that they typically make?
Shall I have a go?
Yeah, of course.
Having made most of them, which is sort of, that's the point of me.
Yes,
But
that's why people hire you.
Exactly. And I think what happens is that they get seduced by the kind of West Coast shininess of an application like Slack. I'm thinking specifically about SaaS, software as a service, more than anything else. And you get a department that does a guerrilla campaign to get Slack in, or to get Salesforce, typically was one. So they get seduced by the kind of Kool-Aid. They drunk the Kool-Aid of those lovely videos online of Salesforce, and they haven't really thought about how they are going to use the system. And I think it gets back to your point about the skill, or your question about skills, is that actually most IT departments don't have those skill set of being able to understand the levers that businesses pull, who pulls them, and what happens when they pull it, because they pull it that way, and then over here something else. All of those things need to be done really carefully before they go. But what typically happens is the head of marketing says, I think we need this. And then sort of there's a whole bunch of data that gets shoved in there with no thought for how it's configured and indeed secured. And you end up with a Wild West because you end up with duplicated data and everything else. So that would be my answer.
Brilliant.
Going into the cloud for the wrong reasons without any thought to it, with an expectation that maybe they're doing it because they're driving a cost saving or whatever, but actually haven't really thought it through. So I would say it's actually going into it blindly because of the buzz.
Sort of buzzwords.
Or because the CEOs thinks, in an organisation has said, you've got to go and do that, because I was talking to this guy the other week, and they're telling me they're doing all this cool stuff in the cloud, so surely we should be doing that, right? And then the IT director's now got this mantra of, well, the CEO told me that's what I've got to go and do, right?
Yeah. No, quite.
So, yeah.
Brilliant. Any further questions from the floor? Yes, gentlemen, there. We'll wrap up after that. Thank you.
Hi, this is more of a kind of strategy question based around, I guess, risk and cost. But how often, or to what extent, do you see companies taking on a multi-service provider strategy versus, let's say, a single service strategy? And what do you think the key drivers behind that really are?
In our world, you would say that most of our customers are taking a multi-service provider strategy because we ourselves may be the service provider in one instance, Azure may be the service provider as part of that same solution, and dare I say, AWS as well. We have customers that are consuming different services for different things. Their e-commerce platform may lend itself to AWS. Their legacy physical, traditional IT infrastructure may lend itself to being in our data center, and some of the other infrastructure may sit in Office 365 or in Azure or whatever it might be. So I think we are seeing, again, because of that journey that we talk about, we're seeing lots of our customers in our organisation we deal with multiple providers in the background. But I suppose our job is all about how can we wrap that up and make that look seamless.
Nice. Monty?
If I could just very quickly add, I think multi-cloud is common, particularly in large enterprise. People are scared at the minute of getting sort of vendor lock-in, and they want to spread their risk, as it were, across multiple vendors. There's a lot of debate going on around that in the market at the minute, particularly with analysts and so on. So I know that Gartner's view is that actually whilst the majority of enterprises' stated strategy is multi-cloud, they think that within 5 years that will go away, because actually the reality is, going back to the skills piece, and one big thing, actually, essentially, you're creating an additional overhead for your business to manage.
Yep.
The complexity of managing multiple vendors at scale, if they're not SaaS vendors, SaaS is different to a degree, but if you're talking about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, having multiple cloud vendors is a big cost and a big complexity for large customers to think about. So it's an interesting dynamic. We're seeing a lot of behavior, across the board. Some people going all in with ourselves. Many of them, probably the majority, in multi-cloud at the moment. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next X number of years, I think.